So we are recording now, and I'm John Turner from Missouri State University, and we're talking about the 4-day school week. And as I've mentioned to some of you before, is that I recently here in the fall of 2023, I got to travel out to Corvallis, Oregon, to Oregon State University to go to a research summit that focused on the 4-day school week. And while I was out there were so many great researchers that I got to meet, and I thought I've got to get this back to our schools in Missouri, and to get a chance to interview these researchers and talk about it. So our I've got two panelists that are joining me here tonight. Sarah Wisdom. Sarah, introduce yourself for me.
Yeah, thanks, John. Sarah Wisdom. I'm the superintendent at New Bloomfield Public Schools. We are right north of Jefferson City, Missouri. And this is our fourth year of being a 4-day school week. So I'm intrigued to learn about some of the statistics of the school districts that have been doing it longer.
Great. And Sarah, introduce yourself for me. Or Sandy, sorry, Sandy.
Sandy Stegel. I'm the superintendent of Clinton County R3 School District in Plattsburgh, Missouri. And we're just about 45 minutes north of Kansas City in the Great Northwest. And we have been a 4-day school week for 5 years.
Close enough.
Close enough. Yeah, I lose track.
I was joking earlier. After you've gotten past the first hurdle, those years just add on. So today, one of the researchers that I met out in Oregon at Oregon State University at the 4-day week summit is Emily Morton. And Dr. Morton works as a researcher at the National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data and Educational Research. Is the short name Calder? Good. Okay. And that's part of the American Institute of Research. So, and Emily was one of the presenters out there. I thought I've got to get her research and her voice here in Missouri so that we can share it with our 4-day school week district. So, Emily, tell us a little bit about the organization you work for, and tell me how you got started looking at the 4-day week. There's not many of us that look at it as far as researchers, and you're one of them. So, where are you coming from, and how did you get here?
It's true. Thanks so much for having me here, John. Really excited to share some of the work that we've been doing on 4-day school week. My role in my organization, I'm a researcher. I focus on issues related to education policy. And really important to our work is that we work in partnership with states and school districts to answer questions about pressing concerns and questions about education policy, typically in the K-12 space. So I really to get to do this work, and one of my favorite parts is actually meeting with the districts who the work is relevant for. So it's really great to have these panelists here as well.
Great, and we're going to talk about some of your specific research, but give us just sort of a general idea what you're looking at as far as related to the 4-day week and what state you're in.
Yeah, so my research has focused on a few different types of outcomes. I've looked at outcomes related to school spending or school finance, looked at achievement outcomes, typically using standardized test scores. And then I've also looked at outcomes related to student attendance and disciplinary incidents.
Great. And so, and as I share this video, I'll also share links to your research too, so people can pull up the full articles too. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Emily. And as you talk about what your research has found related to the 4-day school week, we'll be jumping in with questions and asking for clarification. So we're going to turn it over to you.
So, all right, should I go ahead and share my screen?
That'd be great. I think I've got it set up where you can share your screen.
Way to do that. Great. Okay, can you all see this? Okay. Great. Forgive me, it's on another monitor, so if I look away, that's why. I'm going to start with school finance, everyone's favorite topic. So we'll go through this rather quickly, and then we'll focus more on the achievement effects. And I have a little bit to share also on attendance and disciplinary incidents. This is the school finance data from Oklahoma the Oklahoma State Department of Education helped provide this data. I'm grateful to them. What you'll see here is that I'm going to look at cost savings in a few different categories. So cost savings are a major motivation for districts to adopt a 4-day school week. We have seen in recent years that this motivation has pivoted a little bit more to teacher recruitment and retention. But historically, cost savings have been a major reason for 4-day school week adoption. You can see it trended with sort of the times of the Great Recession, when school spending was a bit tighter. And so it was really to cut back on costs. some of the ways that school districts think they would save money on the 4-day school week is that they could reduce spending on transportation. So especially these are often rural school districts using the schedule. They may have long bus routes, and that also cause a lot of wear and tear on buses. Gas can be expensive. So thinking that that's where they would save. Food services, operating food services 4 days a week rather than 5. This is especially an opportunity for savings if they run food services, if they operate food services at a loss. So when the federal government reimburses them for student lunches that are for students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, if they're operating those services at a loss, they can recoup some of those funds. Operations and maintenance. So if the school district isn't opening the building on that day off, on that 5th day, if they're not running heat or cooling on that day, that can help save some money. Student support services, this might look like different sorts of classified staff. So it could be bus drivers, it could be janitors and other folks who, if they're not working on that 5th day, or if their hours are reduced and then they're also not receiving benefits, that can be a source of savings. And then there's also some thoughts that it might save money on administration. I'm not exactly sure where that's coming from, but there's a question out there of whether it might also cut back on some of the administrative costs. Wonderful. Just by way of a little bit more background, so I already started to talk about some of this, but 4-day school weeks in Oklahoma specifically were adopted for the first time in 2010, the school year 2010 to 2011, after a policy change that allowed them to meet a minimum number of hours instead of meeting a minimum number of hours and a minimum number of days. This is common policy that we see across states that have 4-day school weeks. Adoptions in Oklahoma specifically have very much so been motivated by cost savings in this time period that I'll be studying, even more so than other states. So we think of this as a pretty good sample of districts that were adopting the schedule to save money. In terms of the data, I'm using 13 years of data on school districts that adopted the 4-day school week in Oklahoma, spanning from 2005 to 2017. So I'm going to observe them adopting the schedule and then see how they do as they move forward. We have all of the districts in Oklahoma, so I can compare 4-day school week districts to 5-day school week districts. I have calendar data from the Oklahoma State Department of Education and finance and demographic data from the Common Core of Data. So what all districts submit to the federal government. And then the method I'm going to use is something called a quasi-experimental difference in differences analysis. I'm going to talk more about this when I get to the achievement studies, but it's for short, really, what we're thinking about is comparing how districts that adopt a 4-day school week do over time relative to districts that are similar to those districts, but don't adopt the schedule. So we're going to look at that change over time in districts that do adopt versus change over time in similar districts that don't adopt the schedule. And what I'm going to find is that 4-day school weeks decrease transportation, food, and operations spending. So you're seeing here $2023. I've updated this. If you look at the original study, it's I think in 2022 at $10. So these dollars are a little bit more than that 2020 study. But here you can see that districts save on average in Oklahoma about $56 per pupil in transportation, $109 per pupil in food services, and $122 per pupil in operations. We do want to unpack this food services cost a little bit. So of this cost, only a portion is actually going back into the district's pocket. That's because when we look at where they're saving money on food spending, but some of that spending is reimbursed by the federal government because students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So what that looks like is here, when we look at revenues, what districts are bringing in from that federal government reimbursement, we do see that their federal revenues actually significantly decrease as well. And about $60 of that per pupil is for food services. So that amount that we saved, only the remainder of that amount is actually going back into the district's pocket. The rest of it is savings for the federal government in terms of that reimbursement. So that's something to keep in mind when we think about how much this is actually saving the district itself. So overall, it was going through the cost stuff rapid fire, but the 4-day school week is only minimally reducing costs. They're reducing per pupil district expenditures in total by about $387 per pupil, or about 2%. When we account for what goes back to the federal government, this is actually about $327, or about $68,000 in total. Sorry, $327 per pupil, about $68,000 total. That number is definitely potentially, meaningful in some of these districts. This is the average amount that it would be saving. So for a district who has a larger budget, it might save more, thinking again, rest right around 2%. And so understanding what this amount means in the context of these districts is important. But we do feel pretty confident that this is not like gangbuster saving strategy. It's not going to be really making an enormous difference in the amount of savings or the amount of spending that the district is doing. It is about 2%. So again, on average, it's possible to be of practical significance, but it's not necessary. It's not huge, I think, is something we can be pretty sure about. I'm gonna move on to achievement now.
I tell you what, let's stop there just for a second, Emily.
Perfect.
Sandy and Sarah, you guys are making sure your balancers are budget balance. What are your thoughts there as when we're talking about money? Does that, like Emily's saying, it could be significant dependent on your school district, but it's going to be pretty small in most general cases. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah.
Sarah says, yeah. How about you, Sandy?
Yes, mine has, I've always heard around the 2% savings, which to us is a staff member is kind of what we correlate it to. So that $50,000 to $60,000 range is an FTE for, would be for my district. So yes, that is very accurate.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, in the small rural schools that, we're close to 700 students, the impact of the financial impact is going to be smaller, right? Especially spread out. So, when we moved to 4-day, it wasn't because of money, but I think that's some great research to show that if you're doing it solely on that, it may not be the biggest benefit.
And if we go through and look at the generations in the state of Missouri, like Sandy, one of your neighboring school districts, of course, Lathrop was one of the first ones to go. And when Lathrop did it, they did save significant amounts of money, but it was by the way they rolled it out. I mean, they cut custodians down to 4 days. They didn't, try to balance out hours. And so our adopters that we see now are saying, these people that we're cutting hours on are our lowest paid people in the district, and I don't have the heart to do that. And so the board is reluctant to do that. So we figure out how to make sure that it's comparable. And with that said, of course, we've got a huge change coming on board in Missouri, with Independence being the largest school district in the state, adopting it this year with over 14,000 students, completely out of our norm in Missouri. And Dale Hurl, their superintendent, tells me it's going to cost him more this year. So because of things that they're doing on the 5th day, and other things that they're doing as far as professional development on 5th day professional development, that it's definitely not a money saver in that large school district of Independence that's rolled it out this year. But great. It sounds like we agree with you on Emily.
I would say, John, too, John, you bring up a good point. If anybody's looking at going to a 4-day, it really is in those costs that you pay your hourly employees. And so if you adjust their hourly rate so they don't lose money, you're not going to have as much savings. And so I think that's a piece to think about for school districts. It would be interesting to see how many districts did adjust that so they didn't lose pay, and how many did adjust it so that wasn't a negative impact on their salary for moving to a 4-day.
Yeah, great. Okay, Emily, go ahead and proceed. Let's talk about what are we doing to those kids now?
Yeah, just want to say I think what you're all pointing to is that like implementation matters. So how you do this can change what the impacts are. And so if you're doing it to save money, then there's different ways that you can leverage this to potentially juice that a little bit more. If you're not doing it to save funds, then maybe we wouldn't see an impact on savings, because there's certainly ways that you can implement the schedule without leading to a lot of savings. So that's helpful, and I think will be helpful context as we start to talk about achievement, where implementation also matters. I'm going to share the results from 3 studies that I've done. Each study sort of builds on the previous one, and the last study, I think, is where we have some of the best evidence. Again, by way of a quick background, there was really little research or comprehensive evidence on the academic impacts of 4-day school weeks before 2020. So all of this is, in the world of research, very new information on the achievement impacts. We do see, on average, 4-day school weeks, they reduce their time in school by about 85 hours per year. It's from a national survey that our wonderful colleague Paul Thompson did. 4-day school weeks have longer school days on average. Of course, they're redistributing that instructional time from that extra day that they take off into the other 4 days. It's on average about 52 minutes longer per day. And they start school about 13 minutes earlier on average than a 5-day school week. We can expect some of these things based on the past research to have potential negative impacts on achievement. So earlier school start times, we know, especially for middle school students, can have a negative impact. And having longer school days may require more focus. I think people are especially concerned about that for younger students, and that instructional time matters. So having less time in school potentially could have negative impacts on students, but we don't actually know if this specific amount of time matters. So this change, will it have negative impacts, is an open question. Academic effects are, of course, a major concern for policymakers. There's many ongoing legislative debates, your state included, about whether 4-day school week should be allowed. And a lot of times the reasoning for their debates is based in the academic impacts and concerns about achievement. Academic effects are really difficult to monitor. So that's one of the major challenges of actually understanding this policy and implementing it. Stable or increasing proficiency rates can be misleading. So what I mean by that is that often superintendents and even policymakers, what they might have available to them is looking at a district's proficiency rate over time. So looking at, when they adopted the 4-day school week, how did their proficiency rate, how did their student test performance improve or stay the same or decline? And even seeing an improvement in that proficiency rate can be misleading as if we interpret it as an effect of the 4-day school week. What we would really want to know in a world that doesn't exist, but in a perfect world, would be how that district would have done if they stayed on the 5-day school week, if they hadn't adopted the 4-day school week. So if your students would have grown even more if you hadn't adopted the 4-day school week, that would really be what we'd want to know. Is that 4-day school week impacting their academics negatively? And on the flip side, would they have grown less? Could the 4-day school week actually be leading their proficiency rates to increase more than they would have if they had stayed on a 5-day school week? So that's why we use the strategy that I'm going to talk about more in this minute to analyze this. Unfortunately, it means it's really difficult for any one district to actually really assess their own the academic impact of the 4-day school week. This method is what we use across a lot of different studies. So there's a growing body of evidence using this method to try to understand the impact. And it's really grown a lot over the last 3 years, looking across different states, across different contexts. So I'm going to share some of that. I'm just going to share specifically 3 studies that I've done that examine academic impacts across different outcomes and populations. So in the first study, I used district level state test scores from 2009 to 2016, looking at grades 3 through 8 in Oklahoma. I'll take a step back and just say most of the evidence we do have at this point is on grades 3 through 8. There are 2 studies, one of which I'm going to share today on high school students, but we have less information about how this impacts high school students. My next study is the one that looks at high school students. I look at district level ACT scores from 2008 to 2019 in Oklahoma. And the third study I'll share results from is a working paper, a study that's ongoing right now that looks at student level NWEA spring test scores For anyone unfamiliar with NWEA, it's a test that's administered fall, winter, and spring to measure student achievement, and often links closely to standardized state test scores in the spring as well. And so we look at not only just their spring test scores on NWEA, but we also look at that fall to spring growth, their gains. And we think that's a better measure to look at the impacts of 4-day school weeks, because it's concentrated to that school year. And this is a school year policy, so it gets rid of some of the sort of like statistical noise we might expect from the summer. We look at both of those different metrics, and we use data from 2009 to 2019 for students in grades 3 through 8 across 6 different states. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to take you through this. This is the method that I've been talking about. This is the difference in differences analysis, and that this is how we estimate the causal effect of a 4-day school week. So when I present the estimates that I'm going to present, how we interpret these estimates it's the effect of being on a 4-day school week over time relative to the effect of staying on a 5-day school week. And that's what we're really interested in when we understand the effect of this policy on student achievement. So just as an example, quickly, what you're going to see here on the y-axis going up and down, you see the outcome is standardized math achievement. This is just a hypothetical example. And then on the x-axis, what you're seeing is time. So pre-treatment, when all districts are still on a 5-day school week. And then when you move to the right, you're going towards the post-treatment time period, where some districts will have adopted the 4-day school week, those treated districts would have adopted, and your control districts would have stayed on a 5-day school week. So what we're doing, what you can see here is what I'm comparing is change over time. So in this example, you're seeing that controlled districts and treatment districts in the pre-treatment period before adopting a 4-day school week, they're trending similarly. Their scores are moving in similar ways over time. And then at treatment time, we observe, in this example, hypothetical example, we observe a drop in the green treatment districts, the districts that adopt a 4-day school week, relative to those control districts that stay on the 5-day school week. So in this hypothetical example, when we compare what happens to the green districts to what we would have expected to happen to them if they hadn't adopted a 5-day school week, based on those, if they hadn't adopted a 4-day school week based on those control districts, that's what we estimate as that effect of that policy. So that's that highlighted yellow portion there. Happy to take questions on this as well later. But this is how we get at what is that actual impact of the 4-day school week. And so all the estimates that I'm going to present are exactly what that is measuring. In the first study, they look at grades 3 through 8 state test scores in Oklahoma. I'm going to do one more piece of setup quickly that we talked about before. That's really important to understand what these effects mean. So how do we actually interpret the size of one of these effects? What I'm going to present are standard deviations. So standard deviations in test scores in math or ELA. And what does like a 0.05 standard deviation change mean? For some of you superintendents, this may be very familiar, but for the average person, this doesn't really mean anything. And so when we think about, or when we look at a bunch of educational interventions over time, what we find is that a 0.05 standard deviation effect is generally something we think of as a small effect in education. For reference, this is a really rough approximation, but in 5th grade, a student on average might gain about 0.4 standard deviations in their achievement over the course of the year. So 0.05 would be roughly, a smaller portion of that. We can think about it as a pretty small amount of the actual gains that a student would get over the course of a year. All the way up to 0.2 would be what we consider, based on the existing evidence, roughly a medium effect. There you're getting almost to a half of a year. So that's a pretty big, much bigger impact for an intervention. But you'll notice I don't have large on here. The lines only go to medium. That's because all of the effects that we'll talk about today of the 4-day school week are either small or medium at largest. So that's important to keep in mind when we're interpreting what these effects mean as trade-offs for the other benefits or drawbacks of the policy. Okay, without further ado, I'll show you what I find in my first study, again from Oklahoma. I don't detect a significant effect of the 4-day school week on math or ELA achievement based on standardized test scores in Oklahoma. So you do see that the average estimate here is negative, but those tails, which are sort of the confidence interval, or where we really are confident statistically our estimate lives, includes 0. So we can't be sure that that's effect is statistically significantly different from 0. So we don't detect an effect in this case. And it also shows study number 2, when you jump into impacts on ACT scores in Oklahoma, I again don't detect a significant effect of the 4-day school week on math or English ACT scores over time. So here we're seeing the math estimates actually just slightly above 0 and the English estimates just slightly below. But again, those tails are much wider, and we're seeing that the effect is really sort of keeping 0 within its bounds. So we can't say that there's a positive or large positive or negative effect of the 4-day school week. Great.
Emily, can I ask a question on that last one?
Of course. Yeah.
So if we are looking at like charts like this for our district, what would be a point of concern? So like if we get our data, like what would be something that we would want to take pause if it showed this or that?
Yeah, so I think where we would want to be concerned is what I'll show in a minute is with in the last study, we do detect some negative effects, and those bars, those confidence bars, don't include 0. So it gives us some concern that we're pretty confident there is actually a real negative effect. But what I'm going to show you more in a minute is also matters which districts. So there's some different factors about how you implement it and who is implementing it that are associated with lesser effects or larger effects. One thing I think I want to reiterate on this that is important is that these bars, the other thing they let us do is they let us rule out effects that are larger than where the bar starts and ends. So we can actually rule out that the 4-day school week is positively impacting achievement more than 0.05 standard deviations per year. And we can rule out that it's having an effect larger than negative 0.15 standard deviations. So I'm pretty confident based on this that the effect isn't huge. What to be careful about is it sort of depends on how the width of these bars can also depend on how many observations you have in your study. And so as you have more observations, they get narrower because you can generate a more precise estimate. But based on the data, I can still be confident that we don't see a negative effect larger than negative 0.15 and almost around closer to negative 0.1 for ELA in this study.
Thank you.
Yeah. Course in statistics. Thank you for bearing with me. So, when we look, now we're going to move on to the study that's using the NWEA map data. And so one of the advantages of this study, to the last point, is that there's a lot more students in this data set when we're looking across states and we have more years of data. So we're actually able to get a more precise estimate than we have been in the past 2 studies. I have been. So here we're looking at the impact on spring scores, which should be comparable to the last 2 studies looking again at spring state test scores. And we find significant negative average impacts in reading only, driven by non-rural districts. So that's an important piece of this. What I'm going to do is set up here on the left, I'm going to show you the impacts across all of the districts in the study, and then I'm going to break it out into rural districts and non-rural districts. So here, what we're seeing, you see spring achievement is on the y-axis. Again, it's that NWEA spring test score. And then you see your purple estimate in math and your blue estimate in reading. The math estimate is not statistically significant, similar to what we saw in the last 2 studies. Those bars include 0. The reading estimate is statistically significant and it's negative. So we're seeing a negative 0.07 standard deviation impact, which is just a little bit above that small effect threshold. So we're seeing would be in the medium range of a negative impact on reading over time. When we break this out, this is a really important piece of this, the average does not tell the whole story. So for rural districts, we see both math and reading impacts jump up towards 0, and math actually, even the average goes above 0. So in rural districts, we aren't detecting a significant negative effect of the policy on math or reading scores. We're finding that actually the negative impacts are driven primarily by the larger districts doing this adopting 4-day school weeks. So that's in math, we're seeing a negative impact of negative 0.08 standard deviations, and in reading negative 0.11 standard deviations. These are some of the larger impacts that we've seen from 4-day school weeks. So this again is closer to a medium impact in roughly around, we might think about like a quarter of that 5th grade school year. So that 0.4 typical increase, this is roughly almost a quarter of that. So something that's a little bit more meaningful here in terms of a negative impact. When we look at fall to spring gains, I know gains are often becoming much more part of state accountability, thinking about growth within school years. So this is another way to think about that. And again, is maybe a more precise measure of the impact of 4-day school weeks without including that summer period. And we find significant negative average impacts in math and reading, but driven by non-rural districts. So here, when we get a little more precise, we do see that negative impact on average in math that we didn't detect in the last study, last group, but we see negative impact in math and reading, again, really hovering just right around that small impact threshold. Then when we break it out into rural and non-rural districts, we again see that the rural districts effects jump up towards 0. We do start to see a hint of more of a negative finding in reading at negative 0.04 standard deviations, but this is within that small effect threshold. So something where you'd probably be considering more about trade-offs and thinking about what this effect means in the context of your district and the benefits you might be getting from the 4-day school week. On the right side, we're seeing the non-rural district effects, and you're seeing again they're larger. So they're driving the negative average effects that we see across districts. They're closer to negative 0.1, negative 0.08, negative 0.09, which again would be roughly that quarter of the 5th grade school year. So a rough approximation, but trying to give some context for what these might mean. In summary, what we really know from all of this is that with additional evidence, as we're building evidence, there's growing concern that 4-day school weeks can negatively impact achievement, but these averages don't tell the whole story. So these negative impacts are concentrated among elementary and middle school students. There's another study that I didn't present today that also suggests that those effects are smaller in high school, just like we saw in my study. So the K through 8 students are potentially more negatively impacted. And I should say actually grades 3 through 8 are who we have evidence on. And then again, that these negative impacts are concentrated among non-rural districts as opposed to the rural districts that are adopting the policy. And rural districts are more commonly adopting this policy than non-rural districts. So that's a really important factor. And then as we look to future research, priorities will think about our understanding the implementation features that reduce or prevent negative impacts. So that's something I will share just a really brief amount about from one of my colleagues' research does show that instructional time matters. So perhaps not a huge surprise, but the amount of time that a 4-day school is in school is related to how much of a negative impact they see. So the schools that have more instructional time per year on the 4-day school week schedule are seeing less negative impacts of the policy on their students. Yeah. So that's a huge important factor, but there's more to understand about how we implement it. And if you're doing activities on Friday, if you're doing other sorts of things on the schedule, are there ways to either remediate the negative effects, really have no impact on academics relative to staying on a 5-day school week, or even push students ahead relative to a 5-day school week? And then another big priority is understanding long run impacts. So thinking about different types of college, going career outcomes, post-secondary outcomes following high school, even high school graduation rates is an area for additional research as well. And other ways of measuring academic success and life success are things that we haven't been able to study quite yet, but are definitely important for moving forward. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. So my first question is on your colleagues' research on instructional time. Is there a optimal school day length that school districts that are 4-day should look at leveraging as far as the research on what's an optimal school day length?
Great question. He does have some evidence on the total amount of time per year. We have suggestive evidence that districts that run at least 32 hours per week are performing better than districts that run less than 32 hours per week. So that's, do the math, 8 hours per day. But it's a complicated question about how we think about this. Is it like really hours per day, or is it total hours in the year? And we don't have great evidence on that quite yet. But I think understanding generally more time, the better.
And then I think my other question too is, it would be interesting, and you talked about like not having those outcomes yet as far as or evidence to support other than standardized tests, how we could leverage like what we're doing on the 5th day, or different things within our schedules that we are doing to maximize that learning. And so is there any thought about, are there indicators out there that we can use and leverage as part of our data besides standardized tests that would be beneficial to look at?
Absolutely. So I think there's also a lot of discussion around the 4-day school week in terms of, and tell me if I'm not answering your question, but in terms of other sorts of benefits of the schedule. So in student mental health, social emotional learning skills, other sorts of indicators like that. And so some districts we've worked with have taken school climate surveys and other things like that to assess their students' experiences in the school. One thing that I would recommend schools who are about to consider the transition would be to survey their students before making the change, so that they'll have something to compare to from the previous year. For districts that are already 4-day school weeks, it's something to monitor and just, make sure that your students are maybe meeting thresholds that you would want them to, and making sure that you can understand their experience on the 4-day school week through surveys or interviews and things like that is one way to think about it. Other sorts of metrics that you might use are like high school graduation rate is definitely something that's accessible to districts. Post-secondary outcomes, it depends on the district how much information you end up getting on this, but that's another thing you could look at over time. Are students enrolling in college? Are they pursuing sort of career options within the area or outside of the area? I know the career and technical education is a huge part of a lot of these districts. So understanding if they're getting certifications or other types of things, and how that's looking over time is really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah, I like to talk, so I'm going to let you have a chance, because if I get started, we won't get out of here.
Well, I think she was answering most of my questions as she went. But I think, the key part of that is there's some other factors. And I think Dr. Morton kind of talked about that a little bit too, is those other factors, whether it's what you're doing on the 5th day, or how you implement it, or how many hours you go through the school year. So I think, it can vary so much, but I appreciate this data because we went right when COVID started. It wasn't a reaction to COVID. It was right before COVID. We had made the decision to go the next year. So we don't know, our district doesn't know 4-day in our statistics without COVID. And so that has skewed our statistics so much that how do you look at attendance and things like that when you have that COVID piece in it, right? I think we're finally getting back, and hopefully we'll have some data, the next couple of years. But, John knows that we are very proud of the things that we do on the 5th day, and so I'm intrigued to see the results of that and what that shows on some of Dr. Morton's work. But it's great information, so thanks for sharing.
And I think kind of to tag on that too, one piece that is extremely difficult to measure is we did it for staff retention and recruiting. And so we are close to Kansas City. And so our salary schedule, as much as I want to match those of a larger school, I just can't get there. And so it was more of a benefit. And so I always stated that, to have a high quality teacher in there 4 days a week is better than, somebody, an average teacher 5 days a week. And so how do we, recruit and retain those high quality teachers, because that's a direct correlation to your scores. And so, I think that's a piece in it. And when you have more applicants, then you have more choice in who you select. And so I know our first year we went, our applicants doubled. And it was amazing because you could actually choose. I know right now it's difficult because of the teacher shortage, everybody's scrambling, but I think that's a huge piece of that too, is how do you get your district to be selected as the one that they go to, and the number of work days. And that plays a huge part on it, especially after coming off of COVID and working from home and being exposed to that. Like, people appreciate their time and that 5th day. So
understanding teacher impacts on teacher recruitment and retention, I think, is one of the big areas for this research to go next, and is something that a lot of folks are, including me, are working on now. You nailed it. That the whole point of that, right, is to have better outcomes for students. So we would want to see that sort of like trickle effect on students. And the way we can get at that is comparing you all to districts who are in similar locations and dealing, similar salary schedules, who are not adopting the 4-day school week. And so that's where you get a really meaningful comparison there.
Emily, this is very self-serving because it's going to be very focused on Missouri, but where we are in Missouri is back when Sarah Wisdom was adopting it at New Bloomfield, or Sandy's adopting it up at Clinton County. Jefferson City didn't pay a whole lot of attention. They might have not liked it, and they might have been grumbling about it, but they were probably going to let it happen because they knew about the funding inequities. They knew that Sandy can't compete with St. Louis or Kansas City, and they knew that Sarah can't compete with Jefferson City and Columbia on the salary scale. So they were going to sort of cover their eyes and let that play out. What's happened in Missouri is now we've gotten some larger districts, independents with over 14,000 students adopting this year. And now it's an issue and everybody's paying attention. So if we look specifically on what you've talked about there, because what happens is a legislator goes in and types in on Google 4-day school week academic impacts, and they see articles coming from you, and they see articles coming from Paul Thompson out at Oregon State, and they see that little dot, and they have no idea what those tails of that confidence band means and things like that. So it sort of, tell me what the response is if you're sitting in Jefferson City and the House committee pulls you up there and says, how does it impact it? And again, specifically refocus there on your point about rural versus non-rural, and they're not the same. I know you've talked about it at great length, but I want this to be something that's succinct, that I can know what I should be saying. You said.
That's a great question. So I think it is easy to just miss the point and say that there are negative impacts of 4-day school weeks on achievement. And that averages just don't tell the whole story. So what we know is that there are negative impacts for a subset of districts who do this. So we know that those negative impacts are largely driven by non-rural schools. So schools located in what CCD defines, or NCES defines, as a suburb or a town. Those schools are often also larger, have larger enrollments than schools located in classically, or areas that are classified as rural areas. And that instructional time is the other huge thing that matters. So if I were a legislator, what I would want to emphasize is that if 4-day school weeks are going to be an option to support 4-day school weeks, we would encourage it to be happening more often in districts that are smaller, in rural districts, and in districts that are able to maximize instructional time on the schedule. So maintaining still, of course, you're all legally sort of required to meet the same number of instructional hours as other districts, but making sure that they are perhaps even exceeding that. Depends on the state what your actual requirements are, but thinking about that 32 hours per week measure, thinking about the other sort of total hours in the school year, and making sure that that instructional time adds up for students.
Great.
I don't know if that was succinct, John.
No, but I get it. It's hard. And again, you just understand, people just pull that up and they just see the headline. Yeah. They don't dig down into the weeds. And again, that's something that I have to go through and explain. And I remember, especially out of Paul Thompson, our common friend, Paul Thompson to Oregon State. He had an early study that came out of Oregon. And of course, you say you live in Portland. So you know, the way it was rolled out in Oregon is very different than how it's rolled out in Missouri. And I know that when school districts rolled it out in Oregon, many of them lost instructional hours since the beginning of Missouri. That was not a, you couldn't do that. I mean, if you transitioned, you had to either make your day longer or make your school year longer because you had to maintain the same number of instructional hours. So that was always my first response, was that, you know, if you looked at Paul's full paper, and there were colleagues that were working with him, and you may have been on that one too, as it said, it was very clearly that it could have been on these loss of instructional hours when the school made the transition. And in Missouri, we've always sort of put on our shelf is that when you made the transitions, you had to maintain 1,044 hours. But I know that there is some new research out there that I know Paul has been a part of, where he's talked about maybe that number needs to be about 1,070 some odd hours, and instead of what we have in Missouri, a minimum of 1,044. So again, we're just trying to figure out how we use this research that you all are doing, and how do we apply it in Missouri to make sure that we're doing this as best we possibly can. And of course, we have to be able to justify that to legislators who rightfully are protecting the public schools of Missouri, and making sure that we're still maintaining rigorous instruction if we're forced to go this way of the 4-day week. So we just want to make sure that we're getting a true interpretation from the researchers about what you say this says, so that sometimes people just won't read the first 2 lines or 3 lines and wear out by the time they get to the second page.
Absolutely. It's a great point. Yeah.
Can I piggyback on what you just said? Because that's been a topic in our district since we moved to 4-day. So I know you said, Dr. Moore, you said 32 hours a week. Is that, how many weeks are you based on your school year off of?
It's a good question. It varies across districts. So that's where it's really difficult to, it's actually really difficult to get measures of instructional time because it's not federally reported. So that's where we have a limitation in the data. But that's what John was saying, is that 1,070 hours over the course of the year. We can measure it different ways. That's probably a better measure of like the total exposure to instruction that students are getting. And that's maybe a benchmark to target.
Yeah, and I think I asked that question because one of the things when we moved was we were well over that 1,044. You know, we were at 1,100 something. And you know, with the restrictions that the legislators have put on our calendar with our start date, we meeting those was tough, and so we did shorten it. We're still over the 1,044. We're still, you know, well over that, but you know, we did reduce it a little bit from what we were. So finding that sweet spot, you know, it looked like we were reducing educational hours, which we were, but we actually gained more time in our calendar per se for instruction. But getting people to see that was difficult. So that's why I asked that question, like, what's the magic number of?
Making me think of another point that I find so interesting about this, and think is also really important, is when you reallocate that day. Another thing that, like, the best information that we don't have that we'd want to know is, like, how does it impact your, like, minutes of math, your minutes of reading, your minutes of art, those sorts of questions where we don't have great insight into that. And so, of course, when you cut lunch on Friday, the lunch period, you don't have to give students another lunch period during Monday through Thursday. So trying to understand, really, I think that's another piece of advice that I would have for a district either considering a 4-day school week or legislators, is to internally audit, you know, in your own district, what is this doing to the total number of minutes and hours that students are going to get in each subject? Can we be, first of all, sure that we're not, you know, impacting that? Is there a way to maintain those hours? And then is there a way to even potentially increase them on the schedule, so that we can be sure we're not going to negatively impact achievement?
You know, and one of the things is great. I wish you could have all gone to Oregon with us, because and
Yeah.
Emily, one thing I wish we'd had some time where those of us that research this could have just sat around and just brainstormed and just batted off ideas against each other. But one of the things, just visiting with one of our colleagues there, and we were talking about the attendance issue, and for example, kids losing instructional time, and this person was specifically talking about Montana, and not that Sarah and Sandy's kids are traveling the distance that some people have to travel to play a team in Montana, where the football game may be 5 hours away one way, you know. And but with that said, is that it was one of those things where practical applications, as a former principal and superintendent, I could see, but the researcher couldn't see, is that if that 5th day I'm scheduling that 5-hour trip to allow them to go play that football game, that long distance on the 5th day, so they're not out of class. That's really different than them having to leave at 10 o'clock in the morning to go play a football game that night, and they're missing instruction that day because they're traveling to that game. And the researcher said to me, they said, yeah, but that'll come out in the data. Well, that won't come out in the data in Missouri, because I know Sarah and Sandy, when their teams leave early, they're not counting them as absent. And so we may be generating a report, that's an excused event. There's going to be no way to see if that kid missed that afternoon math class because they were traveling to a basketball game 3 hours away. And so that's one of the things I looking forward, I wish we could have had some of that. I just had it because I used to do that. I used to be a principal and a superintendent, so I know how we code those student absences for long trips. And where a practitioner would be able to see that, a researcher's just looking at that as accurate information. And I'm not saying it's not accurate. I'm just saying that if a kid is leaving to go on a school-sponsored function, that's not counted as an absence. But in our heart, we know they're missing on a 4-day week 25% of their math by going to that ball game for that week.
If you have half of your, like, it's a lot of these districts, 75% or more of the student body participates in athletics, and so you might be missing. The math teacher who's missing half of her students on Friday might not be excited to go into the next lesson because they're going to have to catch everyone up the next day. So you might actually, even though only 50% of the students aren't in the class, at most, then maybe all of the students actually aren't getting the material that Friday because it feels like it would be unfair to the other students. So that can be a really big piece of this.
You bet. Or the math teacher could be the coach, and they're out. You got a sub in there.
Yeah, too.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Most of the rural districts, everybody's coaching point. But I also think that in our transition to do education differently, we can't miss the fact that instructional time just doesn't happen during the school day from 8 to 3:40. That I have some of our grow your own teachers, that we're working through that do work like they're doing it of an evening. We have a school store, and some of those people, fill orders, and they are engaged in learning at 8 o'clock at night, and none of that time is captured, in our schedules. So there's a lot of outliers, which makes it hard, I'm sure, for you.
And of course, in that Friday time as well, so if you, I'm assuming it's a Friday, but Friday or Monday, whichever day your district takes off, but that 5th day time, if that's instructional time, that might also not be captured in the studies. I think what we can learn from the studies is that on average, what we're seeing when we take a, broad swath of was we see these trends, and we can sort of rely on these trends as information that suggests pretty strongly that the more time that students are getting in school is related to less negative impacts of the schedule on achievement.
Great. And Emily, I want to thank you so much. Sarah, I want to thank you, and Sandy, I want to thank you too. But I really want to thank you, Emily, because like I said, when I came and heard you present, there were a few of those slides there. And when you start showing those tales of confidence, that was like, this has got to be shared. I've got to make sure that this gets out. And it was so kind of you to be willing to join us here. And I promise it's going to be sent out to everybody in Missouri. They'll be talking about you and they'll see it. But I appreciate it. So any parting shots you have for us, Emily, as far as, and again, this is primarily going to be going out to people that are on the 4-day week, just give me your general takeaway about what they should be watching for. You've talked about it, but again, just summarize, especially looking at what you're looking at, what they need to be careful about.
Yeah, so I think the main thing I think about is instructional time. That's that when you make the switch, can you look at your own numbers and make sure that the time, you're not shortchanging your students. So the time, the minutes of math, and you can include that time that they would have been missing for sports, that's like real and counts in terms of what they would be recouping in terms of the minutes that they're getting of instruction. So making sure that instructional time doesn't change, monitoring your own achievement on the schedule, looking, even if it's not perfect, watching your proficiency rates, watching your students' scores over time to see how the schedule might be impacting your own students. And then just, being sure that you're being really conscientious about the different trade-offs of the policy in your district. So I think a lot of districts think there are a lot of other benefits to the policy that they're experiencing. And so making sure that we take sort of a holistic view of education and think about all of the different purposes of schooling when we evaluate this policy.
Dr. Emily Morton from the American Institute of Research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Morton.